One of the world's richest, most notorious drug kingpins broke out of prison.
Former cartel leader is considered one of the most dangerous drug traffickers in the world.
El Chapo became the most wanted man in the world.
Sometimes the most dangerous criminals hide behind the most innocent faces. What if I told you that the man known around the world for outrunning prisons, evading armies, and building one of the largest criminal empires in modern history left behind a body count that no court, no journalist, and no investigator has ever been able to fully calculate? Behind the legend, behind the movies and the music and the prison breaks that made him a kind of outlaw folk hero, is a much darker story most people never actually look into, one involving betrayal, fear, and decades of bloodshed tied to nearly everyone who ever got close to him. This is the many murders of El Chapo, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why his name alone still makes investigators on 2 continents nervous, more than a decade after he was finally caged for good. Before we go further, I want to be clear about something, because it matters. Not every killing connected to the Sinaloa Cartel was personally ordered by Joaquin Guzman. Some were. Some were allegedly ordered by him, according to sworn testimony from men who worked beside him. Others happened because of a war he started, a culture he helped build, or a structure of fear that operated whether he gave the order or not. This video is not going to pretend we know more than we do. It's going to walk through what prosecutors said, what witnesses testified to under oath, what journalists uncovered, and what remains disputed to this day. Because behind the myth of El Chapo, behind the movies and the memes and the prison escapes that made him a kind of outlaw legend, is a question that rarely gets asked with any seriousness. How many people actually died because of the empire built around this one man? And what did that violence actually do to the people who had nothing to do with the drug trade at all? Stay with me, because this story goes far beyond one man. It becomes a look into how cartel power actually functions, how fear is manufactured and maintained, and how an entire region of Mexico lived through decades of bloodshed while the rest of the world watched a folk hero get built in real time. Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera was born on April 4, 1957, in a small rural settlement called La Tuna in the municipality of Badiraguato, in the state of Sinaloa. This is not a minor detail. Badiraguato sits in a mountainous region known as the Golden Triangle, where the borders of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua meet. For generations, this land has been one of the most productive opium and marijuana growing regions in North America. Poverty was common, state presence was thin, and for many families, growing illegal crops was less a criminal choice and more the only economic option available. Guzman was one of several children born to Emilio Guzman Bustillos and Mara Consuelo Loera Perez. According to multiple journalistic accounts and later testimony, his father was a cattle rancher who was also involved in growing marijuana, and by several accounts was physically abusive toward his children. Guzman reportedly left school after only a few years of education, some accounts say around 3rd grade, and began working to support the family from a young age, including selling oranges as a child, according to some retellings. Though these early biographical details come largely from oral history and later interviews, rather than documented records, since nobody was keeping detailed files on a poor child in a remote mountain village in the 1960s. What we do know with more confidence is that by his teenage years and into early adulthood, Guzman was already connected to the drug trade that dominated the region. This was not unusual for Badiraguato. The area had produced other major trafficking figures, and the local economy was, in many ways, built around the cultivation and movement of opium poppy and marijuana long before Guzman was an adult. He is widely reported to have been mentored, directly or indirectly, by Dr. Elguero Palma, and more significantly by Miguel Angel Flix Gallardo, a man often referred to as the godfather of the modern Mexican drug trade. Flix Gallardo had unified several smaller trafficking operations into what became known as the Guadalajara Cartel during the late 1970s and through the 1980s, and Guzman is believed to have worked under this umbrella organization learning logistics, smuggling routes, and the relationships with growers and transporters that would later define his own operation. This is where it's important to pause and explain the broader conditions, because the violence that would come later did not appear in a vacuum. Throughout the 1980s, the United States intensified its war on drugs, particularly cocaine, which was flooding into the country primarily through Caribbean and Florida routes controlled by Colombian trafficking organizations. Most famously, the Medellin Cartel under Pablo Escobar. As American law enforcement cracked down on those Caribbean routes throughout the mid to late 1980s, Colombian traffickers increasingly turned to Mexican organizations who already had established smuggling infrastructure across the southern United States border to move cocaine northward instead. This shift transformed Mexican trafficking organizations from regional players, mostly moving marijuana and heroin, into central players in a much larger and far more lucrative international cocaine pipeline. The money that came with this shift was almost unimaginable for organizations that had previously operated at a smaller scale, and with that money came the ability to buy weapons, buy protection from corrupt officials, and buy the loyalty, or at minimum the silence, of entire communities. Guzman entered this system at almost exactly the moment it was transforming into something far more dangerous and far more profitable than it had ever been. In 1989, Flix Gallardo was arrested in connection with the torture and murder of American DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, a killing that had occurred in 1985 and had triggered a massive binational manhunt and a permanent escalation in how seriously the United States treated Mexican trafficking organizations. With Flix Gallardo facing prosecution, the Guadalajara cartel fractured. According to widely reported accounts, Flix Gallardo essentially divided up trafficking territories, or plazas, among his former lieutenants in a meeting sometimes referred to informally as a kind of underworld summit, assigning different regions to different former subordinates to avoid an all-out war over the collapsing organization. The Tijuana corridor reportedly went to the Arellano Flix brothers. The Ciudad Juarez corridor went to Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who would later become known as El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies, for his use of aircraft to move cocaine. And the Sinaloa-based operations, centered around the Pacific Coast smuggling routes, became associated with a group of leaders that included Guzman, along with figures like Hector El Gero Palma and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, among others. Whether this division was as orderly as some accounts describe, or whether it set the stage for years of violent jockeying for position, is itself debated by historians of the drug trade. But what's not debated is that the fragmentation of the Guadalajara cartel created several newly independent power centers, all of them now competing over the same smuggling corridors into the United States. And all of them now far wealthier and far better armed than their predecessors had been just a few years earlier. This is the environment that gave rise to what would become known as the Sinaloa Cartel, and it's worth explaining clearly, before we go further into specific violent incidents, how violence functioned inside organizations like this one. In a legitimate business, disputes get settled through contracts, lawsuits, regulators, or simply through one company losing market share to a better competitor. In an illegal trafficking organization, none of those mechanisms exist. There's no court you can sue when a rival cartel steals your shipment. There's no regulator you can complain to when a corrupt police commander takes a bribe from your competitor instead of you. Violence, and the credible threat of violence, became the only enforcement mechanism available. If you wanted to protect a smuggling route, you needed people willing to use force to defend it. If you wanted to expand into a rival's territory, you needed to be willing to use force to take it, or convince the rival's own people to switch sides, often through a combination of money and intimidation. And if someone betrayed you, whether by stealing money, talking to authorities, or simply being suspected of disloyalty, the response needed to be severe enough that nobody else in the organization would consider doing the same thing. This is not a justification, it's an explanation of the internal logic that turned routine business disputes into a body count that would eventually run into the tens of thousands across Mexico over the following decades. Guzman's specific rise within Sinaloa is often attributed by journalists and later by trial testimony to a combination of factors. He was reportedly extremely hands-on with logistics, personally involved in planning smuggling routes, including innovative methods like tunnels under the United States border, which would later become one of his signature techniques. He cultivated relationships, sometimes through violence and sometimes through money, with growers, pilots, truck drivers, and local officials. And critically, he formed an alliance with Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garca, a partnership that would become the backbone of what outside observers eventually started calling the Sinaloa Cartel, even though, as later trial testimony would reveal, the organization itself functioned less like a single corporation with one chief executive, and more like a federation of allied trafficking groups who cooperated, competed, and sometimes turned on each other depending on the moment. The first major violent event widely associated with Guzman's rise occurred in 1992 and 1993, during what's often referred to as the Tijuana Cartel War, a conflict between Guzman's faction and the Arellano Flix organization that controlled the Tijuana Plaza. According to accounts that later emerged in journalism and court proceedings, this conflict began over territorial disputes as Guzman's organization reportedly sought to expand its smuggling access into the lucrative Tijuana-San Diego corridor, one of the busiest border crossings in the world, and therefore one of the most valuable smuggling routes available. The most infamous incident connected to this rivalry occurred on May 24, 1993, at the Guadalajara International Airport, where Cardinal Juan Jes Posadas Ocampo, the Archbishop of Guadalajara, was shot and killed along with 6 other people in a hail of gunfire. The killing shocked Mexico and the world. Initial reports and the official government investigation concluded that gunmen working for the Arellano Flix organization mistook the Cardinal's vehicle for one carrying Guzman, who they were allegedly attempting to assassinate, and opened fire in what was described as a case of mistaken identity. This explanation has been disputed for decades. Some journalists and researchers have questioned whether the Cardinal was truly an unintended target, or whether the official story was a convenient narrative that avoided uncomfortable questions about the relationship between the church, organized crime, and corrupt officials in the region. What's important to understand here is that even one of the most famous violent incidents associated with the early Guzman era is not a clean, fully resolved case. It's an event where the broader context, a war between rival cartels for control of smuggling territory, is well documented, but the precise details of who ordered what and why remain genuinely contested even decades later. In the aftermath of the Cardinal's killing, the Mexican government faced enormous pressure to act, and Guzman became a primary target. He was arrested in Guatemala on June 9, 1993, just weeks after the airport shooting, and extradited back to Mexico, where he was charged in connection with the Cardinal's murder, along with other charges related to drug trafficking and the killing of rival cartel members. This is an important early example of how, even at this stage of his career, Guzman was already being connected by Mexican authorities to violent acts carried out in defense of cartel territory, even as the precise chain of command and intent behind specific killings remained difficult to prove in a court system that was, at the time, widely understood to be compromised by corruption at multiple levels. Guzman was sentenced to over 20 years in prison and was held primarily at Puente Grande, a maximum security federal prison in the state of Jalisco. What happened during his incarceration there became one of the most consequential periods of his entire career, not because of new killings during this specific window, but because of what it revealed and enabled going forward. Multiple investigations, journalistic accounts, and later testimony described Puente Grande under Guzman's incarceration as functioning less like a maximum security prison and more like a base of operations he continued to run from inside the walls. Reports described him bribing prison officials extensively, being allowed visits from associates and reportedly women he was involved with, continuing to direct trafficking operations, and living in conditions that included access to alcohol, conjugal visits beyond official allowances, and even reports of being allowed to leave the facility periodically. This period matters enormously to understanding the violence that would follow, because it demonstrated something that would define Guzman's entire career: the depth to which corruption inside Mexican law enforcement and the prison system could be purchased, and how that corruption directly enabled trafficking organizations to continue operating, continue earning money, and continue maintaining the resources needed to wage violent territorial conflicts, even when their nominal leaders were supposedly behind bars. On January 19, 2001, Guzman escaped from Puente Grande. The most widely repeated version of the story, which became central to his growing mythology, claims he was smuggled out hidden inside a laundry cart, pushed by a prison guard who had been bribed. Subsequent investigations would reveal that dozens of prison officials, guards, and even the prison director were implicated in facilitating the escape in exchange for bribes, and many were later prosecuted. Whether the laundry cart detail is entirely accurate, or has become somewhat exaggerated through retelling, is something researchers have debated, but the broader fact that Guzman's escape was made possible through extensive systemic corruption rather than some singular act of physical daring is well documented. This escape is the moment where Guzman transformed from a known but contained cartel figure into a fugitive whose continued freedom became a symbol, for some Mexicans, of the impunity enjoyed by organized crime, and for others, perversely, of a kind of folk hero defiance against a state widely seen as corrupt and ineffective in the eyes of communities that had little reason to trust authorities to begin with. What followed his escape was, by most accounts, the bloodiest and most consequential period of cartel violence in modern Mexican history. And this is where the story stops being primarily about one man and becomes about an entire system of conflict that consumed the country for the better part of 2 decades. With Guzman free, the Sinaloa Cartel, now operating under the loose alliance structure that included Guzman, Zambada, and other allied figures, began an aggressive expansion campaign that historians and journalists often refer to as an attempt to consolidate control over smuggling routes across multiple Mexican states, frequently at war with other organizations who controlled territory the Sinaloa group wanted access to. This period saw repeated, devastating conflicts, and we're going to walk through several of the most significant ones, always being clear about what's documented versus what remains alleged or disputed. One of the most significant conflicts involved the Gulf Cartel and its enforcement arm, a paramilitary group called Los Zetas. Los Zetas had originally been formed from deserters of Mexico's special forces, the Grupo Arambil de Fuerzas Especiales, recruited initially as muscle for the Gulf Cartel, before eventually splitting off to become one of the most violent organizations in Mexican history in their own right. The conflict between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Gulf Cartel Zetas alliance, sometimes referred to broadly as part of the Mexican Cartel Wars or the Mexican Drug War that intensified dramatically starting around 2006 and 2007, is widely credited by analysts as one of the major drivers of the explosion in cartel-related homicides that swept across Mexico during this period. Estimates vary, but multiple academic and journalistic sources have placed the total death toll from Mexico's broader cartel conflicts during this era, spanning roughly from the mid-2000s through the 2010s, somewhere in the range of well over 100,000 people killed, with tens of thousands more reported as forcibly disappeared, their bodies never recovered. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of number that can be misused. Not all of these deaths are attributable to the Sinaloa Cartel specifically, and certainly not to Guzman personally ordering each one. This was a multi-sided conflict involving numerous cartels, government forces, vigilante groups, and a Mexican government strategy under President Felipe Calderón starting in 2006 that deployed the military directly against cartel organizations. A strategy that many analysts argue actually fragmented existing cartels into smaller, more numerous, and in some ways more unpredictably violent splinter groups, rather than reducing violence overall. What can be said with confidence is that the Sinaloa Cartel, as one of the largest and most powerful organizations during this period, was a direct party to an enormous amount of this violence, both as an aggressor seeking to expand territory and as a target of rival organizations and at times of the Mexican and American governments. Let's talk specifically about some of the incidents and patterns that prosecutors and investigators have directly tied to Guzman's organization, based on court testimony, particularly from the extensive 2018 to 2019 federal trial in Brooklyn, New York, where Guzman was ultimately convicted on multiple counts including drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. This trial is significant for our purposes because it produced sworn testimony under oath from multiple former close associates of Guzman who had become cooperating witnesses for the United States government in exchange for reduced sentences. This testimony represents some of the most direct evidence connecting Guzman to specific acts of violence that exists in the public record. Though it's worth noting that cooperating witness testimony, especially from individuals receiving reduced sentences in exchange for their statements, has inherent credibility questions that defense attorneys raised extensively during the trial, and that any responsible accounting of this case has to acknowledge. Several cooperating witnesses, including former Sinaloa Cartel logistics coordinator Jesus Rey Zambada Garca, the brother of Ismael Zambada, and former cartel associate Isas Valdez Ross, along with others, testified about the internal operations of the organization, including descriptions of how the cartel dealt with perceived betrayals, informants, and rivals. Testimony described, among other things, the existence of what prosecutors characterized as essentially private enforcement squads connected to the cartel's security apparatus. Witnesses described specific instances where individuals suspected of cooperating with authorities, of stealing from the organization, or of working with rival cartels were killed. And some witnesses testified that Guzman was directly involved in ordering, or even, according to some testimony, personally present at specific killings. Though again, this testimony came from individuals with incentives to cooperate and should be understood within that context. One of the most widely reported and disturbing pieces of testimony from the trial came from a witness who described an incident in which Guzman allegedly ordered the killing of a man suspected of betraying the organization, with testimony describing the man's brutal death by the witness's account. This kind of testimony, when it emerged during the trial, generated enormous media coverage, in part because it reinforced existing narratives about cartel brutality, and in part because it came directly from someone who claimed to have witnessed it. It's important to note that testimony like this, while given under oath and subject to cross-examination, represents an allegation from a single witness about a specific event, not something independently verified through forensic evidence or multiple corroborating sources in the way a documentary should ideally present established fact. The jury in the Brooklyn trial ultimately found the prosecution's broader case, including extensive testimony about the cartel's violent enforcement practices, credible enough to convict Guzman on all counts he faced, but the specific granular details of individual killings described by witnesses exist primarily as sworn testimony rather than as independently confirmed historical fact in every instance. Beyond the trial testimony, journalists and researchers covering the Sinaloa Cartel over multiple decades have documented broader patterns of violence connected to the organization's territorial conflicts, and it's worth walking through several of the specific regional conflicts that define different periods of cartel warfare during Guzman's years of operation, because these conflicts illustrate how violence in this world tends to cascade, with each killing prompting retaliation, which prompts further retaliation, in cycles that can run for years. The conflict over Ciudad Juarez, just across the border from El Paso, Texas, became one of the most violent urban battlegrounds in the Western Hemisphere during the late 2000s and into the early 2010s. This conflict was primarily between the Sinaloa Cartel, seeking to take control of the Juarez smuggling corridor, and the Juarez Cartel, which had controlled the territory since the era of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and was, by this point, led by the Carrillo Fuentes family, along with an enforcement arm known as La NEA. The human cost of this specific conflict was staggering. Ciudad Juárez, a city with a population of roughly 1.3 million people at the time, saw homicide rates that made it, for several years running, one of the most dangerous cities in the entire world by official statistics, with thousands of murders annually at the conflict's peak between approximately 2008 and 2011. Investigators and journalists who covered this period extensively documented how ordinary residents of Juárez, people with no connection to organized crime whatsoever, became caught in the crossfire, with businesses extorted, families fleeing the city entirely, and entire neighborhoods essentially abandoned as residents sought safety elsewhere. This is a crucial point that often gets lost in narratives that focus exclusively on cartel leadership figures like Guzman. The overwhelming majority of victims in conflicts like the Juárez War were not cartel members at all. They were taxi drivers, shop owners, students, and bystanders who lived in territory that had become a battlefield for organizations fighting over smuggling profits that most of them never saw a single dollar from. A particularly devastating and well-documented incident from this period occurred on January 31st, 2010, when gunmen opened fire at a birthday party in the Villas de Salvarcar neighborhood of Ciudad Juárez, killing 15 people, most of them teenagers, with many more wounded. Initial government statements suggested the victims were connected to gangs or organized crime, a characterization that was later widely criticized and largely discredited after investigation showed that most of the victims were students with no documented connection to criminal organizations at all, gathered simply for a birthday celebration. The massacre became a symbol of how the broader cartel conflict, including the territorial war connected to Sinaloa Cartel expansion into the region, was devastating civilian populations who had no involvement in the underlying conflict whatsoever, and it sparked significant public outrage in Mexico over how quickly authorities had been willing to label murdered teenagers as criminals rather than acknowledging the failure to protect civilian life. President Calderon visited the city following the massacre amid intense public anger, an event widely seen as a turning point in public skepticism toward the government's broader military strategy against cartels, since the strategy was clearly not preventing this kind of mass civilian death. Another major front in cartel violence. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, this region experienced repeated waves of violence connected to internal disputes within the broader Sinaloa Cartel alliance structure itself, not just conflicts with outside rivals. This is an important and often underexplored part of the story. The organization commonly referred to as the Sinaloa Cartel was never actually a single unified hierarchy the way popular media often portrays it. It functioned more as a federation or alliance of semi-independent trafficking groups, and internal disputes between factions within this alliance produced significant violence over the years, separate from the cartel's wars against outside rivals like the Zetas or the Juárez Cartel. One of the most significant internal ruptures involved the Beltran-Leyva brothers, who had been longtime close allies and reportedly relatives by some accounts, or at minimum extremely close associates of Guzman for years, helping run significant portions of the cartel's operations, including security and enforcement. The alliance between Guzman and the Beltran-Leyva organization collapsed dramatically around 2008, following the arrest of Alfredo Beltran-Leyva, with the brothers and their associates reportedly believing, according to multiple journalistic accounts, that Guzman had betrayed them by providing information to authorities that led to the arrest, in an effort to eliminate them as rivals within the broader alliance and consolidate power for himself. Whether this is precisely what happened remains a subject of dispute among different accounts. But what followed was an extremely violent split. The Beltran-Leyva organization, now operating independently and in direct conflict with their former allies, was connected by Mexican authorities to numerous high-profile killings during this period, including the assassination of senior Mexican federal police officials. and the conflict between the Beltran Leyva organization and the remaining Sinaloa Cartel structure under Guzman and Zambada produced years of additional bloodshed across multiple states, illustrating how quickly alliances within organized crime can dissolve into some of the most vicious conflicts of all, precisely because former allies know each other's operations, safe houses, and personnel in ways outside rivals never could. This pattern of internal betrayal leading to extreme violence repeats throughout the history of the Sinaloa Cartel, and is frankly one of the more underappreciated aspects of how cartel violence actually works, compared to how it's often portrayed in popular media. The most dangerous threat to a cartel leader is frequently not a rival organization, but a former lieutenant who knows everything about the operation and has decided, for whatever reason, that the relationship has become more dangerous than profitable. Guzman's eventual downfall, which we'll get to, was itself ultimately the product of this exact dynamic. Let's talk about the role of informants and how suspicion functioned as both a cause and a consequence of violence throughout this story, because it's central to understanding the climate of fear that organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel relied on to maintain control. Throughout the period of Guzman's most significant power, both Mexican and American law enforcement relied heavily on developing informants within cartel organizations, sometimes through financial incentives, sometimes through threats of prosecution against the informant or their family members, and sometimes through genuine ideological motivation from individuals who had grown disillusioned with the violence they were participating in or witnessing. The existence of these informants, and the cartel's awareness that informants existed somewhere within their ranks, created a pervasive culture of suspicion that itself became a driver of additional violence, as organizations sought to identify and eliminate suspected informants, sometimes correctly identifying actual cooperating witnesses, and sometimes, according to multiple journalistic accounts over the years, killing individuals based on mere suspicion that turned out to be entirely wrong. This dynamic is part of what made cartel violence during this period so unpredictable and so terrifying for ordinary people living in affected regions. It wasn't just that rival cartels might kill you if you were perceived as connected to the wrong organization. It was that your own organization might kill you, or someone you loved based on suspicion alone, with little to no due process of any kind, because the cost of being wrong about a suspected informant was, from the cartel's perspective, far lower than the cost of allowing an actual informant to continue operating. This is the system of fear that maintained cartel power for decades. And it's worth being explicit about it. Fear worked not because every person killed was guilty of something, but specifically because the violence was unpredictable enough and severe enough that compliance and silence became the only rational survival strategy for people living within cartel-controlled territory, whether or not they had any actual connection to criminal activity. Now let's turn to the relationship between the Sinaloa Cartel and Mexican political and law enforcement corruption, because this is a thread that runs through nearly every major event in this story, and helps explain how an organization could operate with this level of violence for this many decades without being dismantled. Throughout Guzman's career, multiple journalistic investigations, court testimony, and government reports have documented allegations of extensive corruption connecting Mexican political figures, police commanders, military officials, and prison administrators to the Sinaloa Cartel and to organized crime more broadly. Perhaps the most explosive allegation along these lines emerged during the 2018-2019 Brooklyn trial, when cooperating witness Alex Cifuentes Villa, a former close associate of Guzman, testified that Guzman had paid a large bribe to former Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. Peña Nieto, through representatives, strongly and immediately denied this allegation. And it's important to be precise here. This is a single witness's testimony, presented as part of a criminal trial, and it has never been independently corroborated through documentary evidence, and no charges have ever been filed against Peña Nieto in connection with this specific allegation. We mention it not because it's confirmed fact, but because it illustrates the scale of corruption allegations that have surrounded this case throughout its history, and because understanding why an organization this violent could operate for this long requires understanding that, according to extensive documented reporting independent of this specific unverified allegation. Corruption within various levels of Mexican law enforcement and government was a persistent and well-documented feature of the broader environment Guzman operated within for his entire career, even if the specific details of who took what money remain disputed in many individual instances. This corruption had direct consequences for the violence we've been discussing. When local police commanders were compromised, cartel enforcement operations could proceed with minimal interference. When prison officials were compromised, as we saw with Guzman's first escape, even incarceration failed to actually remove dangerous figures from operational control, and when the broader public increasingly understood that official institutions were compromised. It created exactly the kind of climate where cartel-administered violence, rather than state justice, became the dominant form of law that actually governed daily life in significant portions of Mexico, even though this was never officially acknowledged as state policy. Let's slow down here and look more closely at the formation of Los Zetas, because it fundamentally changed the nature of violence in Mexico in ways that directly affected the Sinaloa Cartel for years afterward. In the late 1990s, a Gulf Cartel leader named Osiel Cardenas Guillen made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential in the modern history of organized crime in Mexico. Rather than relying solely on traditional cartel enforcers, often poorly trained civilians with access to weapons, he began recruiting directly from the Mexican military's elite Special Forces unit, offering deserting soldiers salaries far beyond what they could earn in the legitimate military. These men brought military-grade training and tactics, weapons handling, and small unit combat operations into the world of cartel enforcement. For years, Los Zetas functioned as the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel, but by around 2010, they split off entirely to become their own independent. Previously been rare, including mass public executions designed explicitly for psychological effect. The targeting of civilians as a means of territorial control rather than simply collateral damage, and brutal acts of violence specifically intended to be circulated. Studying the rise of Los Zetas is essential context for understanding the conflicts the Sinaloa Cartel engaged in during this period. Because as Los Zetas expanded their own territorial ambitions, clashing with the Gulf Cartel they had once served, and then with the Sinaloa Cartel and its allies in a series of escalating conflicts across multiple Mexican states, the overall character of cartel violence in Mexico shifted towards something more public, more theatrical, and more openly terroristic in its methods than what had typically characterized cartel conflict in earlier decades. Some of the most horrific mass casualty events of Mexico's cartel war period are attributed primarily to Los Zetas rather than to the Sinaloa Cartel directly. But the broader war between that one organization's tactical innovations tend to provoke from competing organizations during the height of cartel violence, as communities that had lost faith in both government protection and any form of cartel-imposed order began arming themselves to resist cartel control directly. While these groups were most prominently associated with the state of Michoacán and conflicts with organizations other than the Sinaloa Cartel specifically, similar dynamics played out in portions of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, where Guzman's organization operated as some rural communities, exhausted by years of extortion, forced recruitment of young people, and unpredictable violence, attempted to organize armed resistance. The existence of these movements tells us something important about the actual lived experience of cartel control in affected regions. It was not, contrary to some romanticized portrayals, a system that communities passively accepted or even tacitly supported in any broad sense. It was frequently a system imposed through fear that communities resisted when resistance seemed survivable, and that produced its own further cycles of violence when cartel organizations responded to these resistance movements with renewed force. Let's turn now to a specific and lesser discussed chapter of this story: the role of logistics infrastructure that allowed organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel to move drugs at the scale they did. Because understanding the sheer scale of this operation helps explain why the violence connected to protecting it was, from the organization's internal logic, considered an acceptable cost of doing business. testimony from the Brooklyn trial, along with extensive prior reporting from the Drug Enforcement Administration and journalists who covered cartel logistics over the years, described an operation that at its peak involved fleets of aircraft, submarines, and semi-submersible vessels capable of carrying multiple tons of cocaine across open ocean from South America toward Mexican and Central American coastlines, an extensive network of tunnels under the United States-Mexico border, some of them engineered with rail systems, ventilation, and electrical lighting rivaling the sophistication of the tunnel used in Guzman's 2015 prison escape, and a logistics network involving thousands of people across multiple countries responsible for everything from growing and processing raw materials to transportation, storage, distribution, and the laundering of proceeds back into the legitimate financial system. Witnesses at trial testified to cocaine shipments measured not in kilograms, but in metric tons, with some individual shipments described as involving multiple tons of product in a single transaction, representing street values that could run into the hundreds of millions of dollars for a single shipment. This is the financial scale that made the violence we've discussed throughout this video. From a cold business logic internal to the organization, seem like an acceptable operating cost. When individual shipments were worth this much money, the willingness to kill anyone who threatened that revenue, whether a rival trafficker, a suspected informant, or a corrupt official who failed to honor a bribe, became simply part of the overhead required to protect an enterprise of this magnitude. It's worth pausing here to discuss the American side of this equation directly, because a documentary focused entirely on Mexican cartel violence without acknowledging the demand side of this market risks telling an incomplete story. The Sinaloa Cartel smuggling operations existed because of sustained, massive demand for cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and eventually fentanyl within the United States, a demand that has persisted across decades, regardless of shifts in drug policy, law enforcement strategy, or which particular trafficking organization happened to control supply at any given moment. Multiple researchers studying drug policy have pointed out that the fundamental economics driving cartel violence are rooted in prohibition itself. Because these substances are illegal, their production and distribution cannot be regulated through normal business and legal channels, which means disputes get resolved through violence rather than courts. And which means the profit margins involved are extraordinary, specifically because the product is illegal and therefore artificially scarce relative to actual production costs. This is not an argument about what drug policy should be, which is well beyond the scope of this video, but it is an important piece of context for understanding why this violence existed at the scale it did for as long as it did. It was sustained by a market that, however much law enforcement resources were devoted to disrupting it, has consistently demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, with new trafficking routes, new organizations, and new drugs of choice continuing to emerge each time previous networks were disrupted or previous leaders were captured. Let's now look more closely at the specific period following Guzman's first escape from Puente Grande in 2001, because the years immediately following that escape, roughly 2001 through 2004, represented a critical period of consolidation for the Sinaloa Cartel that set the stage for the larger wars that would follow. During this period, according to multiple journalistic investigations and later testimony, Guzman worked to rebuild and expand his network, forming what would become the core alliance structure of the modern Sinaloa Cartel. This included strengthening ties with Ismael Zambada's organization, which controlled significant smuggling infrastructure in its own right, and with the Beltran Leyva brothers, whose later betrayal and conflict with Guzman we discussed earlier represented one of the most significant ruptures in cartel history. This period also saw Guzman's organization extending influence into Pacific Coast trafficking routes and developing relationships with Colombian cocaine suppliers directly, reportedly cutting out some of the intermediary relationships that had previously existed. A business move that, while increasing profit margins, also increased direct exposure to violence connected to negotiating and maintaining these supplier relationships across international lines, since Colombian organizations had their own histories of violent enforcement and their own expectations about how business disputes would be resolved. It's during this consolidation period that some of the earliest specific allegations connecting Guzman directly to ordering killings, as opposed to simply leading an organization broadly understood to be violent, began to be documented by journalists and later cited in legal proceedings. Reports from this era described internal cartel discipline enforced through killings of associates suspected of skimming profits, failing to deliver promised shipments, or showing signs of disloyalty, patterns that would later be confirmed in greater detail through trial testimony, but that journalists covering the Sinaloa region had been documenting, often at considerable personal risk. Throughout the early 2000s, several regional journalists who reported on these patterns during this period later faced threats, and in some documented cases, violence themselves, illustrating again the pattern we discussed earlier regarding the dangers faced by press covering organized crime in Mexico. Now let's spend some time on a topic that deserves more careful attention than it often receives in popular coverage of this case: the relationship between the Sinaloa Cartel and rural farming communities in Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, the communities that actually grew the opium poppies and marijuana that formed the foundation of the broader trafficking economy before cocaine and later fentanyl became more central to operations. These farming communities occupied a deeply complicated position within this entire system. On one hand, cultivation of these crops provided income in regions where legitimate agricultural alternatives were often limited by poor soil conditions, lack of infrastructure, and minimal government investment in rural development. On the other hand, these same communities bore enormous risk, both from government eradication efforts that sometimes involved aerial spraying of herbicides with documented health consequences for residents, and from the cartel organizations themselves, who set prices for raw product, sometimes through negotiation, but frequently through coercion, leaving farmers with limited bargaining power and significant exposure to violence if cartel relationships soured for any reason. Researchers and journalists who have spent time in these growing regions have documented a complicated reality that resists simple narratives in either direction. These were not communities uniformly supportive of cartel operations, nor were they simply victims with no agency in the system, but rather communities navigating an extremely difficult set of economic and security realities shaped by decades of both government neglect and cartel presence, often making rational economic decisions within a deeply constrained and dangerous set of circumstances. Let's turn now to a specific incident that received significant international attention and illustrates the complexity of attributing specific violence to specific organizational decisions: the 2010 killing of two American and Mexican investigators ultimately connected these killings to the Barrio Azteca gang, an organization believing the victim's vehicle belonged to a rival gang member. Several individuals were later convicted in connection with these killings in American federal court. This incident is included here specifically because it illustrates a pattern we've returned to repeatedly throughout this video. Violence connected to the broader cartel conflict during this period frequently affected people only tangentially connected, or in this specific case, entirely unconnected, to the actual underlying disputes driving cartel warfare. And the chain of cause and effect connecting individual deaths to specific organizational decisions and rivalries is frequently more complicated and more tragic in its randomness to plant-based substances like opium and marijuana, changed both the economics and the violence patterns connected to the organization over time. Beginning significantly in the 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, the Sinaloa Cartel, along with other Mexican trafficking organizations, increasingly moved into clandestine labs, generating profit margins even more extraordinary than those connected to cocaine or methamphetamine. This matters for our broader documentary because it represents perhaps the most direct illustration of the point we made earlier, removing Guzman from operational control of this organization in 2014 and again in 2016, and ultimately sentencing him to life imprisonment in 2019, did not end the violence and harm connected to this organizational structure. It continued to evolve, adapt, and in the case of fentanyl, arguably caused even greater harm to American communities than the organization had caused during the period of Guzman's direct personal leadership, even as Guzman himself sat in a supermax cell with no ability to direct these operations. Let's spend some additional time now on the specific experience of law enforcement and military personnel on both sides of the border who were directly involved in operations against the Sinaloa Cartel, because their experiences add another dimension to understanding the human cost of this conflict that's frequently underexplored. Mexican military and federal police personnel involved in operations against major cartel organizations, including the Sinaloa Cartel, faced documented patterns of targeted violence throughout this period, including assassinations of senior commanders, attacks on military convoys, and in some documented instances, the killing of officers' family members as a means of intimidation. A particularly brutal tactic intended to discourage continued enforcement action by making clear that opposing cartel operations carried risk not just to the individual officer, but to everyone they loved. This created profound dilemmas for individual officers and soldiers throughout Mexico's security forces cooperating with cartel organizations. Whether through direct corruption or simply through looking away from criminal activity, offered a path to survival and financial benefit, while genuine enforcement action carried personal risk that extended to one's entire family, a calculation that helps explain, without excusing, why corruption proved so pervasive and so difficult to root out even when individual officials genuinely wanted to. Act with integrity. On the American side, Drug Enforcement Administration agents and other federal law enforcement personnel involved in operations against the Sinaloa Cartel, including the extensive multi-year investigation that eventually led to Guzman's 2014 capture and his ultimate extradition and conviction, frequently described in subsequent interviews and congressional testimony the challenges of building cases against an organization with this level of resources, this level of corruption protecting it within Mexico, and this level of sophistication in counter-surveillance and operational security. The successful prosecution of Guzman in 2019 represented, by the accounts of officials directly involved, the culmination of literally decades of accumulated investigative work across multiple agencies and multiple presidential administrations in both countries, illustrating the sheer scale of institutional resources required to successfully prosecute even one figure from an organization of this size and sophistication. Now let's turn to a topic that adds important nuance to how we should understand the scale of violence discussed throughout this video: the methodological challenges researchers and journalists face in actually counting and attributing cartel-related deaths in Mexico, because this helps explain why the numbers cited throughout this documentary involve ranges and uncertainty rather than precise figures. Mexican government statistics on homicides have, at various points throughout the period covered in this video, been criticized by independent researchers and human rights organizations for methodological inconsistencies, including disputes over how to categorize a homicide as connected to organized crime versus categorizing it as a different type of crime. Changes in data collection and reporting standards across different presidential administrations, and in some documented instances, allegations of deliberate undercounting for political reasons, particularly during periods when the government was attempting to demonstrate progress in its security strategy. Independent researchers, including academics at Mexican universities and international organizations tracking violence in Mexico, have developed alternative methodologies attempting to capture a more complete picture, often relying on forensic data, missing persons reports, and the discovery of clandestine grave sites, which have been found in significant numbers across multiple Mexican states throughout this period, sometimes containing dozens of bodies in a single location. These clandestine graves represent one of the most haunting aspects of this entire story. Organizations across the spectrum of Mexican organized crime, including, but not limited to, the Sinaloa Cartel, developed systematic practices for disposing of bodies in ways specifically intended to prevent identification and to prevent families from ever receiving confirmation of what happened to missing relatives, a practice that has left tens of thousands of Mexican families in a state of prolonged uncertainty, unable to fully grieve or achieve closure because they don't know whether their missing family member is alive somewhere, has been killed, or remains in an unmarked grave that may never be discovered. Forensic anthropologists and search collectives, frequently led by mothers of the disappeared, who have taken on this search work themselves due to inadequate government investigation, have spent years developing expertise in locating these clandestine burial sites, work that continues actively today across multiple Mexican states, illustrating that the consequences of this broader period of cartel violence remain very much an ongoing, unresolved crisis rather than a closed historical chapter. Let's also address directly a question that often comes up in discussions of this case: why Guzman specifically became the global face of Mexican cartel violence, when he was, as we've discussed throughout this video, never operating alone and never solely responsible for the violence connected to Mexican organized crime during this period. Several factors appear to have contributed to this specific notoriety. His 2 prison escapes, particularly the elaborate 2015 tunnel escape, generated international media coverage of a kind that few other cartel figures received. Partly because the engineering, sophistication, and audacity of the escapes made for compelling news coverage in a way that, frankly, more routine cartel violence often did not. His extradition to the United States and subsequent very public federal trial in Brooklyn, conducted under intense security and extensive media coverage, gave American audiences direct exposure to detailed testimony about cartel operations in a way that violence occurring primarily within Mexico rarely received in American media. And the cultural products that followed, including dramatized television series, contributed to building a recognizable character and narrative arc around Guzman specifically that other cartel figures, including arguably more consequential ones in terms of overall violence and trafficking volume, never received to the same degree. This is worth reflecting on critically. The global fame attached to Guzman's name is, in significant part, a product of media dynamics and narrative appeal, rather than a precise reflection of his relative responsibility for violence compared to other cartel leaders who operated with comparable or even greater brutality, but who never became household names internationally. Ismael Zambada, for instance, who many investigators and journalists consider to have been at least as operationally significant as Guzman within the Sinaloa Cartel structure for most of its history, remained a far less publicly recognized figure for decades, despite extensive documentation of his central role in the organization, precisely because he avoided the kind of dramatic, headline-generating events that came to define Guzman's public persona. Let's discuss one more specific and significant rivalry that adds another dimension to how cartel warfare evolved over the period covered in this documentary: the conflict between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Knights Templar organization, along with its predecessor, La Familia Michoacana, in the state of Michoacán. La Familia Michoacana, which later splintered into the Knights Templar organization, developed a distinctive operational style that combined drug trafficking with quasi-religious ideology, extensive control over local economies, including legitimate industries like avocado and lime production, and a particularly aggressive approach to territorial control that brought them into direct and sustained conflict with Sinaloa Cartel efforts to access trafficking routes through the state. This conflict, which intensified through the late 2000s and into the 2010s, contributed to the broader wave of violence affecting Michoacán during this period, and was, in part, what spurred the formation of some of the auto-defensive vigilante movements we mentioned earlier. As communities in Michoacán found themselves caught between Knights Templar extortion and control on one side, and the broader instability created by Sinaloa Cartel efforts to displace them on the other. This conflict is also significant because it illustrates how cartel violence during this period increasingly extended beyond drug trafficking specifically into control over legitimate economic activity, with organizations extracting payments from legal businesses, controlling agricultural exports, and in some documented cases, directly participating in industries like illegal mining and logging, demonstrating how the underlying logic of violent territorial control that originated in drug trafficking expanded to encompass broader criminal economic activity affecting far more of the legitimate economy than narratives focused narrowly on drug trafficking specifically tend to capture. As we move toward bringing this documentary to its conclusion, I want to address one more dimension of this story that deserves attention: the experience of the United States-Mexico border region itself, and specifically the communities that exist on both sides of that border, who have lived for decades with the practical reality of being situated along what has been, for much of the period covered in this video, one of the most consequential smuggling corridors in the world. Border communities, from Tijuana and San Diego to Ciudad Juarez and El Paso to Nuevo Laredo and Laredo, have experienced the consequences of cartel conflict in ways that are distinct from communities further from the border itself, including direct exposure to violence connected to control of border crossing points. The economic distortions created by smuggling economies operating alongside legitimate cross-border trade and tourism, and complicated law enforcement dynamics involving cooperation and at times friction between American and Mexican authorities operating across an international boundary that criminal organizations have never recognized as a meaningful obstacle to their operations. Understanding this border dynamic helps explain why American law enforcement agencies became so deeply involved in pursuing Guzman specifically, well beyond simply responding to drug trafficking into American territory. The violence and instability connected to cartel conflict along the border had direct spillover effects on American border communities, including documented instances of cartel-connected violence occurring on the American side of the border itself, even though the overwhelming majority of the most severe violence remained concentrated within Mexican territory throughout this period. Let's turn next to the second capture and second escape that defined Guzman's middle years as a fugitive, because the sequence of events between 2014 and 2016 arguably did more to build his global notoriety than anything that came before it. On February 22, 2014, Guzman was captured by Mexican Marines in the resort city of Mazatlán, Sinaloa, in a coordinated operation that involved extensive American intelligence support, including signals intelligence and surveillance that had tracked his movements for an extended period leading up to the arrest. He was held at the Altiplano Federal Prison, one of Mexico's most secure facilities. This arrest was treated as a major victory for Mexican President Enrique P. Nieto's administration, but the celebration would prove short-lived. On July 11, 2015, Guzman escaped from Altiplano in a manner that became, even by the standards of his already legendary reputation, almost unbelievable. Investigators determined that a tunnel had been constructed running approximately 1.5 kilometers from a small unfinished house outside the prison directly into the shower area of Guzman's cell, complete with ventilation, lighting, and a modified motorcycle on rails that allowed for movement through the tunnel. The engineering sophistication of this escape, combined with the fact that it occurred from one of Mexico's supposedly most secure facilities, reinforced the growing mythology around Guzman in ways that arguably did more to build his global notoriety than almost anything else in his career. The investigation that followed implicated numerous prison officials and raised serious, never fully resolved questions about how a project of this scale and duration could have proceeded without detection, or, many suspected, without significant complicity from people inside the prison system itself. The second escape triggered an enormous manhunt and significant embarrassment for the Mexican government, and it's during this period of renewed fugitive status that one of the strangest episodes in this entire story occurred. In October 2015, actor Sean Penn, working with Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo, conducted a secret interview with Guzman while he was still a fugitive, which was later published by Rolling Stone magazine. The meeting, and the broader episode surrounding it, became a significant controversy, in part because Mexican authorities later stated that the meeting and the efforts to arrange it had played a role in helping investigators track Guzman's movements, ultimately contributing to his eventual recapture. This entire episode is worth mentioning because it illustrates something important about how Guzman's public image had evolved by this point. He had become enough of a global celebrity figure that a major American actor was willing to risk significant legal and personal danger to meet him, in pursuit of what was reportedly an early-stage discussion about a potential biographical film project. This is the mythology machine in action, the way fear and notoriety combined with media fascination to create a figure who existed simultaneously as a documented mass murderer connected to one of the most violent criminal organizations in modern history, and as a kind of outlaw celebrity that A-list actors wanted to meet. Guzman was recaptured on January 8, 2016, following a raid in Los Mochis, Sinaloa that involved a gunfight and resulted in the deaths of several of his associates, and ultimately led to his extradition to the United States in January 2017, where he would face the federal charges that resulted in his 2019 conviction and his current sentence of life imprisonment, plus 30 years, which he is serving at the Adex Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, widely regarded as one of the most restrictive prisons in the United States, specifically chosen given the demonstrated history of escapes from Mexican facilities. Now I want to spend some time on a part of this story that often gets less attention than the killings themselves, which is how El Chapo's public image transformed over the decades from a regional cartel figure into a genuinely global cultural phenomenon, and how that transformation actually complicated public understanding of the violence connected to his organization rather than clarifying it. Throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, as Guzman's notoriety grew, a genre of music and storytelling specific to Mexican and Mexican-American culture, narco corridos, ballads celebrating the exploits, wealth, and defiance of drug trafficking figures, increasingly featured songs about Guzman specifically. These songs, performed by popular regional Mexican music artists, often portrayed Guzman in heroic or quasi-mythical terms, emphasizing his cunning, his ability to evade capture, and a kind of folk hero narrative that resonated particularly in regions like Sinaloa, where economic opportunity was scarce, and where for some communities, cartel figures represented a kind of self-made success story unavailable through legitimate channels. This is genuinely important to understand, not as an endorsement of that narrative, but as an explanation of why it existed. In regions with limited economic opportunity, historically weak and often corrupt state institutions, and a long cultural history connecting trafficking to local economic survival going back generations, figures like Guzman could be perceived by some segments of the population less as the architects of mass violence, and more as folk figures who had beaten a rigged system, even while the same organizations these songs celebrated were directly responsible for extensive and well-documented bloodshed. This tension between mythology and documented reality reached something of a peak with the release of dramatized television series depicting Guzman's life, productions that, while drawing on real events and documented history, inevitably involved dramatization, composite characters, and narrative choices that blurred lines between confirmed fact and entertainment storytelling in ways that shaped global public perception of who Guzman actually was and what actually happened during his rise to power. It's worth being direct about this. A significant portion of what many people around the world believe they know about El Chapo comes not from court records or journalism, but from television dramatizations that, while often well-researched, are fundamentally entertainment products designed to be compelling stories first and historically precise accounts second. This documentary has tried to draw primarily from court testimony, documented journalism, and verified historical events specifically because so much of the broader cultural narrative around this case has become difficult to separate from dramatized fiction. It's also worth addressing directly how media coverage itself, including coverage from legitimate news organizations, sometimes contributed to mythologizing Guzman in ways that arguably obscured the human cost of his organization's activities. Headlines focusing on his wealth, which at various points placed him on lists of the world's billionaires before he was later removed from such lists, tended to emphasize a narrative of audacious criminal success rather than centering the communities devastated by the violence connected to maintaining that wealth. Coverage of his escapes often carried a tone of grudging admiration for the engineering and planning involved, language that, however unintentionally, risked treating extraordinarily violent criminal enterprise as a kind of impressive entertainment spectacle. This is a pattern that extends well beyond just this one case, and it's worth viewers being aware of how true crime media, this video included, has to constantly guard against turning documented human tragedy into something that primarily functions as entertainment, which is part of why we've tried throughout this video to keep returning to the actual human cost of these events, rather than focusing exclusively on Guzman's individual exploits. Let's return to that human cost directly now, because it deserves more attention than it typically receives in stories that center on cartel leadership figures. Beyond the specific named incidents we've discussed, the broader period of cartel conflict connected to Sinaloa Cartel expansion and the wars that erupted around it produced consequences for ordinary Mexican civilians that are difficult to fully convey through statistics alone, though the statistics themselves are staggering. Multiple research organizations and journalistic investigations tracking Mexico's drug war broadly have documented that beyond the direct homicide toll, which various sources place at well over 300,000 people killed in drug war-connected violence across Mexico from 2006 through recent years, tens of thousands of additional people have been reported as forcibly disappeared. Their fates and the location of their remains never determined. Behind each of these disappearances is a family that has spent years, in many cases decades, searching for answers, organizing into collectives of mothers and family members who conduct their own searches for clandestine graves because government investigation into these cases has frequently been inadequate, under-resourced, or in some documented instances, itself compromised by the same corruption that allowed cartel violence to flourish in the first place. Journalists covering Mexico during this period have also extensively documented how violence connected to cartel conflicts displaced entire communities, with families fleeing towns that had effectively come under cartel control or that had become contested territory between rival organizations. Local economies in affected regions were frequently devastated. As legitimate businesses became targets for extortion, tourism collapsed in affected areas, and young people in particular faced a stark and genuinely tragic choice in some communities between extreme poverty with limited economic prospects and the immediate financial rewards offered by cartel recruitment. Rewards that came attached to extraordinary risk of violent death, but that, for some young men with few other options, represented one of the only paths to the kind of money that could support a family. Understanding this recruitment dynamic is essential to understanding why organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel were able to sustain such extensive violent operations for so many decades. They were never short of people willing to take on enforcement roles, because the alternative economic prospects in many of the regions where recruitment occurred were genuinely so limited. Journalists themselves became frequent targets of violence connected to covering organized crime in Mexico during this period, with press freedom organizations consistently ranking Mexico among the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, not due to war in the conventional sense, but specifically due to violence connected to reporting on cartel activity and government corruption. Multiple journalists who reported specifically on Sinaloa Cartel activities and on Guzman himself over the years were killed in circumstances that press freedom organizations and journalist advocacy groups have connected to their reporting, even though, as with much of this story, establishing definitive proof connecting specific killings to specific orders from specific cartel figures remains extremely difficult given the climate of impunity that has historically surrounded violence against journalists in Mexico, where the overwhelming majority of killings of journalists are never successfully prosecuted at all. Let's also talk about the specific role of women within this story. because they're frequently underrepresented in narratives that focus primarily on male cartel leadership. Female family members of cartel figures, including wives, daughters, and other relatives, occupied a complicated position throughout this history, sometimes portrayed in media coverage as glamorous figures connected to cartel wealth, while in reality, frequently facing their own forms of danger, surveillance, and in some documented cases, prosecution for their alleged roles in supporting trafficking operations. Guzman's wife, Emma Coronel Ispuro, whom he married in 2007 when she was 18 years old, was herself arrested in 2021 at Dulles International Airport in Virginia, and subsequently pleaded guilty to charges including conspiracy to distribute cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and marijuana, and conspiracy to launder money. Receiving a sentence of 3 years, she has spoken publicly, including in interviews and a subsequent memoir, about aspects of her life connected to the relationship, providing one of relatively few first-hand accounts from someone inside Guzman's immediate family circle, though her accounts, like other testimony throughout this case, reflect one individual's perspective and should be understood within that context. Beyond Guzman's own family, women in cartel-affected regions throughout Mexico have documented experiences of gender-based violence connected to cartel control of territory, including documented patterns of sexual violence used as a tool of intimidation and control in some cartel-affected regions. Patterns that human rights organizations have specifically documented as part of the broader landscape of violence connected to organized crime in Mexico, separate from and in addition to the homicide statistics that typically dominate coverage of this topic. Now let's address something that requires particular care, and that's the role of children within communities affected by this violence, both as victims of violence directly and as a generation growing up within its long-term aftermath. We mentioned earlier the Villas de Salvarcar massacre, where most victims were teenagers. This was not an isolated case of young people becoming casualties of cartel conflict. Researchers studying the broader impact of Mexico's drug war have documented significant increases in rates of childhood trauma, displacement from schools, and disrupted family structures in regions most heavily affected by cartel violence during the height of these conflicts. Children in some of the most heavily affected regions grew up with direct exposure to gun violence, with the disappearance or death of family members, and with a level of normalized violence in daily life that mental health researchers and humanitarian organizations have specifically studied as a generational trauma with effects that are expected to persist for decades beyond the specific period of peak violence we've been discussing throughout this video. This is perhaps the most important point in this entire documentary, and it's worth pausing on directly. When we tell stories that center cartel leadership figures, the prison escapes, the captures, the courtroom drama, we risk losing sight of the fact that an entire generation of children in significant parts of Mexico grew up inside the consequences of conflicts they had no part in starting and no power to stop, and that the effects of that childhood experience will continue to shape those communities long after Guzman himself and the headlines about him have faded from public memory. Let's bring this back to where we started and talk about what all of this actually adds up to, because I think it's worth being honest about the limits of what any single documentary or any single court case can actually establish about a story this large. Joaquin Guzman was convicted in 2019 on 10 federal counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, a charge that under American law functions somewhat like a kingpin statute, and that, by its nature, holds a defendant responsible for the broader criminal conspiracy he's found to have led, even without requiring prosecutors to prove every individual underlying act beyond a reasonable doubt in the same way an individual murder charge would require. This is an important legal distinction. Guzman's conviction establishes, beyond a reasonable doubt under American federal law, that he led a massive drug trafficking conspiracy responsible for moving enormous quantities of narcotics into the United States over multiple decades, and that this conspiracy involved violence as part of its operations. It does not represent a conviction for each individual killing discussed throughout this video, many of which remain documented primarily through journalism, testimony, and the broader historical record of cartel conflict, rather than through individual criminal prosecutions, specifically establishing Guzman's personal culpability for each death. This distinction matters because it reflects something true about organized crime more broadly that's easy to lose in storytelling that focuses on a single dramatic central figure. The violence connected to organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel was never the product of one man acting alone. It was the product of a system that included thousands of people willing to participate in enforcement violence, a system that included corrupt officials willing to look away or actively participate in exchange for money, a system shaped by decades of American drug policy and the enormous profits created by the simple fact that drug prohibition makes illegal substances extraordinarily lucrative for whoever controls their supply chain, and a system shaped by genuine economic desperation in the communities that provided the recruits who carried out so much of the actual violence on the ground. Removing Guzman from that system, which is effectively what happened with his 2019 conviction and subsequent supermax imprisonment, did not end Sinaloa Cartel operations, which continued under the leadership of Ismael El Mayo Zambada and Guzman's sons, sometimes referred to collectively as Los Chapitos, who themselves have been connected by American authorities to continued trafficking operations, including, according to recent federal indictments, a significant pivot toward fentanyl trafficking in subsequent years, illustrating that the underlying system that produced Guzman's rise was never actually dependent on him personally, even as his name became the one most associated with it globally. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Guzman's longtime partner, was himself arrested in July 2024 under circumstances that remain disputed and somewhat murky even now, with Zambada's own legal team alleging that he was effectively kidnapped and forced onto a plane to the United States by one of Guzman's sons, Joaquin Guzman Elpez, rather than voluntarily surrendering, an allegation that, if accurate, would represent yet another example of betrayal between former allies within this same organizational structure. Decades after the original splits and conflicts we discussed earlier in this video. This is worth mentioning specifically because it demonstrates that the patterns we've discussed throughout this documentary, internal betrayal, the use of family relationships as both bonds of loyalty and instruments of violence, the blurring of lines between voluntary cooperation and coercion, are not historical artifacts confined to the period of Guzman's active leadership. They appear to be structural features of how organizations like this one operate, recurring across generations of leadership within the same broader criminal enterprise. There's one more event worth examining in detail before we close, because it represents one of the clearest demonstrations of the continued power of the organizational structure Guzman built. Even years after his own removal from operational control, when Mexican security forces captured Guzman's son, Ovidio Guzman Elpez, on October 17, 2019, cartel gunmen responded with what amounted to a coordinated military-style operation across the city of Culiacan, deploying armed convoys, setting up roadblocks, attacking military and police positions, and creating a level of urban chaos so severe and so immediately overwhelming that the Mexican government, under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, made the extraordinary decision to release Ovidio Guzman Elpez in order to de-escalate the situation and protect civilian life, a decision that was met with significant domestic and international criticism as an apparent capitulation to cartel pressure, but that the government defended as a necessary choice to prevent further loss of life in what had effectively become urban warfare within a major Mexican city. This event, often referred to as the Culiacanazo, or the Battle of Culiacan, illustrates something important about the actual balance of power between organized crime and state authority in parts of Mexico, even in relatively recent years. In certain regions, and under certain circumstances, cartel organizations have demonstrated a level of coordinated armed capacity that can, at least temporarily, overwhelm or outmatch the willingness or capacity of state security forces to maintain control, a reality that complicates any narrative, suggesting that cartel power has been straightforwardly diminished through the capture of high-profile leaders like Guzman himself. Ovidio Guzman Elpez was successfully captured again in January 2023, in an operation that did involve significant violence and casualties, and he was extradited to the United States in 2023, where he has since faced federal charges of his own. As we bring this documentary toward its close, let's take a step back and think about what kind of broader lessons this story actually offers, beyond simply the specific facts and incidents we've covered. The story of Joaquin Guzman is sometimes told as a story about one extraordinary criminal mind, someone whose cunning, ruthlessness, and willingness to use violence allowed him to build an empire unlike anything that came before it. There's some truth in that framing, but we've tried throughout this documentary to show you something more complicated, that the violence connected to Guzman's name was never really about one man's individual choices, however significant those choices were. It was about a system built across decades, shaped by American drug demand and American drug policy, shaped by Mexican government corruption and institutional weakness that long predated Guzman's rise, and that, by many accounts, persists to this day, shaped by genuine economic desperation in rural communities that provided both the raw agricultural products and the human labor, including the labor of violence, that made organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel possible, and shaped by a media and entertainment ecosystem that, even as it documented real atrocities, sometimes transformed those atrocities into a kind of spectacle that obscured as much as it revealed about the actual human cost involved. When we ask how many murders are connected to El Chapo, we're really asking a question that extends far beyond what any individual investigation, trial, or documentary can fully answer. We're asking about the cumulative human cost of a multi-decade conflict that has touched millions of lives across two countries, that has produced hundreds of thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of disappearances whose full scope may never be precisely known, and that has reshaped entire regions of Mexico in ways that will continue to affect the children growing up in those regions for generations to come, regardless of where Guzman himself sits today, or what happens to the various successor organizations that continue operating in the space he once dominated. There's a particular kind of moral clarity worth holding on to as we close this out, separate from the complexity and uncertainty we've tried to be honest about throughout this video. Whatever the precise number of deaths directly attributable to Guzman's personal orders, and whatever portion of the broader violence connected to Mexico's drug war should fairly be attributed to his organization specifically, versus the many other organizations and structural factors involved, the fact remains that an enormous number of human beings, the overwhelming majority of them people with no meaningful power within these organizations, no share of the enormous profits being generated, and often no connection to organized crime at all, beyond the misfortune of living in an affected region, lost their lives or lost family members because of a system that prioritized profit and power over human life in ways that are genuinely difficult to comprehend at the scale this story actually occurred. That is not a complicated point, even though the specific details surrounding individual incidents throughout this story frequently are complicated, contested, and incompletely documented. The simple, clear truth underneath all of the complexity is that decades of extraordinary violence occurred, that real people with real families and real futures had those futures taken from them, and that the fascination so much of the world has developed with figures like Guzman, the nicknames, the prison escapes, the dramatized television series, the music, the global notoriety, exists in an uncomfortable tension with the actual human suffering that made that notoriety possible in the first place. What do you think about how stories like this one get told, and whether the focus on individual cartel figures like Guzman helps people genuinely understand what happened during these decades of conflict, or whether that focus ends up obscuring the much larger and more diffuse human cost behind the headlines, the court cases, and the entertainment built around his name? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you have other cases or aspects of this broader history you'd want covered in more depth in a future video, I want to hear about those too. Before you go, if this video helped you understand this story in a way that felt honest, grounded, and respectful of the people affected rather than simply sensationalized, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more investigative breakdowns like this one. Till next time.